Welcome back to 1834, chess friends. The score is 5-all, so this is it, the final game of match 3. To mark the occasion, Baldric has written a poem about the futility of war, but we're not going to hear it because I've had enough of his bleeding heart nonsense, so he's fired. Mr. Hackett is back, and the fight is on. So McDonald opens with e4, we have e5, f4, the king's gambit, and we all know that a gentleman must accept a gambit, and Le Bourdonnais no, just kidding, he accepts, and so it's going to be another wild game. Now, during match 3, McDonald has been playing knight to f3 and then bishop to c4, but this time he plays bishop to c4 first. He played 4 games this way in match 1 and he lost all of them, so it's a big surprise. He's gone back to it now for this critical game. What are you going to do? So this allows Le Bourdonnais to come in with his queen to h4 with check. So McDonald moves his king aside to f1, Le Bourdonnais pushes his pawn to g5, backing up the queen, knight to c3, and the bishop goes into the gap left behind by the g-pawn. d4 now, d6, and these are all the same moves from match number 1, game 22, which McDonald lost, as I mentioned. He plays knight to d5 now, and here Mr. Jack Hackett tells me he doesn't like this. He much prefers knight to f3 or even e5. But either way, McDonald didn't do this. He played knight to d5. And this is actually threatening a fork here on the king to pick up the rook, so Le Bourdonnais moves the king to defend. And now we have the bishop back to e2. And again, Mr. Hackett told me earlier when he was sober that this is a weak move, and he doesn't elaborate beyond that, so let's continue. Here, Le Bourdonnais previously played his knight to c6, but this time he changes things. He plays his other knight to f6, and this leads to a knight exchange on that square. Now, a good move for McDonald here might be to play his knight to f6 to chase away the queen, but he doesn't go for this. Instead, he plays e5 to chase away the bishop. So the bishop goes back to e7. We have queen to d3, again not playing knight to f3 to chase the queen. And Le Bourdonnais just develops his other knight now, knight to c6. We have c3 from McDonald trying to build up in the centre, and now bishop to d7 from Le Bourdonnais. He's almost fully developed, but he's lost his castling power, so he can't quite castle. We have g3 now from McDonald trying to chase away the queen with the pawn instead of the knight, and maybe this weakens his king side, but it does make the queen back off. It goes back to h6. McDonald captures the pawn on d6 now, and the bishop captures back, and unfortunately for McDonald, this bishop is now on a very nice diagonal. McDonald responds to this by weakening his king side even further with h4, and Le Bourdonnais doesn't capture it here, he just pushes past it with g4. Now the king is looking under a lot of pressure. McDonald is worried about this pawn coming forward and attacking the bishop and causing all sorts of trouble, so he preempts it by retreating to d1 straight away. And Le Bourdonnais brings his queen across to f6, which is now x-raying the king. Should he take the pawn, yeah, it's going to be a check. So McDonald moves his king aside to e1. We have queen to e7, checking down the nice open file. So McDonald again moves aside to f2. And we have rook to e8, doubling up along the nice open file. And McDonald needs to be really careful here. G captures f4, trying to relieve some of this pressure, but the queen comes flying into e1. McDonald only has one move, which is king to g2, and here it is very clear that Le Bourdonnais has got a far better position than McDonald, and Mr. Hackett says that Le Bourdonnais should continue with something like knight to e7 and then bring his bishop to c6 along the very nice diagonal, and McDonald will be completely done. But instead of this, Le Bourdonnais goes for a queen exchange, queen to e4 with check, so the queens come off the board, and the game is even again, so bad luck Le Bourdonnais, maybe you've missed your chance. Now we have bishop to c2 from McDonald, rook back to e8 because it's under attack, and then the bishop captures the pawn on h7. Now, given that McDonald still has an undeveloped bishop and a knight, this may have been a little bit greedy, but he has now got a passed pawn, so maybe this will work out for him. Le Bourdonnais plays his bishop to e6. He's looking for the d5 square for the nice diagonal that I mentioned earlier, so maybe McDonald should bring his bishop back to help defend this. But he doesn't. He plays his king to g3, maybe going after this pawn. But Le Bourdonnais just goes for this diagonal anyway and threatens the rook, so the rook moves aside. And the problem here is that the black rook can now come into the back rank and really get amongst the pigeons. What does McDonald do? Well, he plays his knight to e2. It's defended by the rook here, but will he ever be able to get this bishop off the back rank now? Bishop to c4 now, creating a double attack on the white knight, which McDonald ignores for now, and he pushes his pawn. This threatens the black knight, which moves to e7, and now attacks the pawn back, whilst the bishop and the rook simultaneously attack the knight. So not so great for McDonald. He decides to save his knight by moving it up to d4 and giving up his pawn. So yeah, not so good. We now have h5, so he's going to continue to try to push this pawn up to the promotion square. But the rook comes across and delivers a check. The king moves aside, and again the rook delivers a check whilst backed up by the bishop. So the king goes back to g3. There's a triple attack now on the pawn from the knight, the bishop and the rook, with only the dark square bishop and the king in defense. So Le Bordenay goes for it, he picks up the pawn, and he's setting himself up to give some nasty discovery checks here once he's moved the knight. So McDonald has to do something about it. So of course he picks up the pawn here. Le Bordenay moves his king to d7 to let his rook out and into the game. McDonald plays b3 to try to chase away this bishop, but it just comes to e6 to give a check. And so the knight captures and the knight captures back. We now have rook across to e2 from McDonald and rook to h8 from Le Bordenay, threatening the bishop. So the bishop retreats to e4 and the white king is looking more and more exposed. The black king has never really been in any danger. Maybe McDonald should have gone for the king sooner. Of course, the rook comes across to give a check and it forces the king to the edge of the board. Le Bordenay gives another check with the bishop, so the king has to retreat to h3. And the bishop comes back to d6. Maybe he's hoping to stop the white rook coming to h2 to help defend the king. McDonald decides just to push his pawn now. It's all that he's got left really, with his rook sort of locked in behind the bishop, which hasn't been able to develop. Now here, Le Bordenay decides that he's going to use his rook to capture the undeveloped bishop, which at first glance seems very daft. But Mr. Jack Hackett assures me that actually, if McDonald now plays rook captures rook, then McDonald will be in a whole heap of trouble because knight f4 with check, forking the rook. Now, this leads to a series of impossible variations for McDonald to get out of. Let's just have a quick look at a couple of them. If, for example, the king moves up here, then we're going to have bishop to e7, which is checkmate. The knight's covering the escape squares on the wing and the rook's covering the whole open file, so he can't move up there. If he goes down, then he's walking into a reveal check when the knight picks up the rook, and he's just going to get repeatedly checked by the knight and the reveals until he's forced upwards, and then the bishop can come across to check, so the king has to move again. He can't come down now because the knight's guarding this square. The rook's coming in for the action, so the king moves aside, and this is a reveal check backed up by the knight here, so the king has to move up again, and it's finally a checkmate. So all sorts of nastiness involved in the future for McDonald if he were to capture the rook with the rook in this position. So instead, he decides that he's going to push his pawn to h7, a desperate attempt to get it across to the other side, and now it's a forced mate for Le Bordenay anyway. The rook can capture the undefended pawn on c3, which comes with check, and the king can't retreat to h2 because the bishop's blocking the way, so he has to move up the board. And now the bishop checks again, and the rook this time is blocking the retreat, so again the king has to move up to h5. And with a click of Le Bordenay's fingers, it's all over for McDonald. It's checkmate on h3 from the rook, covering all these squares, and of course the rook is still here in this open file. So that's it. Le Bordenay wins the game and the third match, 6 games to 5. Well done to him, let's give him a nice crown. And commiserations to Big Mac, who did so well to take it so close, coming back from 5 games to 2 down. So close, in fact, that they immediately set up a 4th match to consist of 11 games. That is the first to win 6, so there will be a 4th match. Now, I will be taking a little bit of a break for now, so I'll see you in the new year for that 4th match. See you then.